So here on our channel, we reviewed the first 150 Avengers comics in the history of this series. Now we're going to talk about a time period when a writer named Jim Shooter almost ruined everything. Before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island for more comic book videos, including our ongoing, complete guide of all the Avengers comics. The Avengers had been in an interesting place after Steve Englehart had left the series. Though personally I didn't enjoy the era, whatever I feel of it, the Avengers at the time were never more popular. But in the mid-1970s, things at Marvel were in a bit of position of flux. A new editor and writer named Jim Shooter was coming to increase prominence within the company. Eventually securing the position of editor-in-chief at Marvel, Jim Shooter also wrote dozens of issues of Avengers along the way. Unfortunately, just about everyone, myself included, have a lot of problems with at least some of the books Shooter specifically wrote. While a lot can be said about Jim Shooter as an editor, less so can be said of his Avengers comics. His time with this series is also a bit unique in that he sort of came, went, and returned to the series, with other writers filling in many gaps along the way. As such, I sort of divided up this era into two parts, the first consisting of a run roughly between 161 to 171, along with the books written from issue 200 to 230, those largely being books written by Jim Shooter, while the second part will talk about books not written by Jim Shooter, published in between Jim Shooter's take on the Avengers series. We'll talk about that second part a little later, and it is confusing but worth doing, because while I understand what the writers were going for in the in-between time period, I have no idea what Jim Shooter was up to for these comics. The most infamous comic that man ever wrote, indeed one of the most infamous single issues of a comic book ever written in Western history, has to be Avengers number 200. I've talked a bit about what is wrong with the book before, but it's pretty self-evident just by going over the plot. Carol Danvers, then Miss Marvel, and a pretty new character at that, was unwillingly impregnated by a cosmic being who she gave birth to. That baby, named Marcus I believe, grew to an adult, assaulted her mind, and forced her into falling in love with him. The two then left for space, the Avengers seemingly oblivious to the disturbing events and happy for their friend entering into an incestuous relationship against her will. It's a gross book written by somebody who simply does not appreciate the disgustingness of his own behavior, and likely has never reconciled with it since. To do this for the big landmark issue, like the 200th Avengers book, simply adds insult to injury. This book has become widely and rightfully ridiculed, while at the time, the co-creator of Miss Marvel, Chris Claremont, was so outraged at the story he later wrote a book where Carol returned, berated the Avengers, and Jim Shooter by proxy, for letting her get used like that, and stayed under the safe custody of the X-Men for a little while. It also began a very, very unfortunate tradition when it came to Avengers writers treating Carol Danvers' character terribly. So it is with all this baggage I found myself returning to the Jim Shooter era, but to be fair, I knew little else of his other Avengers books. Jim's story arcs The Bride of Ultron, the Nefaria Trilogy, and the Korvac Saga were well received as fun bits of action at the time they were released, so maybe there would be something to enjoy beyond the worst Avengers book ever written. I wasn't about to ignore Avengers 200, but I sure was willing to look past it and judge the larger body of work Jim Shooter contributed to Avengers as a whole, if the rest of his work was meaningfully different from one terrible comic. After all, it should be noted that Jim Shooter also wrote the 1984 Secret Wars, a fan-favorite story and one I quite enjoyed too. He also did a lot for comic book writers and artists behind the scenes, and from what I understand deserves a lot of credit for securing certain financial guarantees that he still enjoys to this day. Sadly, I don't like any of his other Avengers books. They all feature villains that by then were already very familiar foes to the team. The well-regarded action simply doesn't hold up that well over time, and there isn't much other reason to enjoy these stories. The artwork feels pretty listless and not very exciting, especially compared to the first 100 issues or so of the series, even though a lot of big names like Buschema and Perez, artists from that time period, were still around. While I applaud the ambition of the Korvac Saga, which featured every Avenger to have ever been on the team up until that point in the story, It, like others, is disorganized and frantic thanks to Jim Shooter, and so the fun of what that moment should be doesn't really feel like it gets lived up to. It should be a bigger deal to have all these Avengers and former Avengers working together to fight this villain, but Jim Shooter really has trouble putting together a coherent sense of a story in these Avengers comics. And worst of all, it becomes pretty clear to me, reading through these Avengers books, that Jim Shooter's writing in Avengers number 200 wasn't some one-off problem or weird fluke, but rather it's part of a pretty consistent and rather disturbing pattern that I think we should talk about a little bit. The thing is, up until now, we haven't really had to talk about how female characters were written in the Avengers because there was no need to distinguish them from how Stan Lee, Roy Thomas, and even Steve Englehart wrote men. In the early days of the Avengers, Scarlet Witch, Wasp, and Black Widow were all pretty well written and felt quite progressive as a whole. Yes, Wasp was and is a fashion designer and has this big interest in fashion, which I guess someone could argue is a very stereotypical girl thing in a team of scientists, military men, and gods especially, but that was always kind of part of her personality and history. It also went a long way to explaining how the Avengers were always wearing colorful costumes that would occasionally change design, especially on Wasp's part. While it should be noted that Wasp's main female teammate, the Scarlet Witch, from the beginning was written as a former terrorist. The message was loud and clear from these early Avengers books. Women could be just about anything, good or bad. Even as Steve Englehart played up the relationship between Scarlet Witch and Vision, Wanda was still a person with her own agency and interests beyond the robot. I mean, Englehart did start writing her in a way that suddenly made her a lot more emotional than she ever was before, willing to shed a tear at a moment's notice as the whole series was morphing into a soap opera. But the main characters were acting just as moody at the time, with Hawkeye outright throwing a temper tantrum at one point. Flash forward to the Jim Shooter era, and suddenly things have changed. It's subtle at first. Jim's books introduce a sense of sexuality to the Avengers. That's good in general, as it makes the team more human-like, and less a set of larger-than-life vague archetypes that better define the character work in the team's early days. And look, I like those early days, but they are very static in terms of their character work. The problem is that at the time this sexuality was slanted so heavily towards women. That's actually unique to the Jim Shooter era in the history of Avengers, by the way. While many Avengers comics following Jim Shooter's time with the series would very much play up sexual tension and sexuality in general, they always did so to men and women alike. And while I'm not saying that it has to be done to both genders equally, deeper than that is the loss of agency. Our female characters suddenly found themselves driving stories less than their male counterparts and being affected by events more. Carol's pregnancy is a good example of that in action, but this absolutely includes Wasp, who is relegated to reacting to her increasingly volatile and bizarre husband, which Jim Shooter started to focus on over time. And don't worry, I'm not done talking about that yet. The whole thing is so cartoonishly over the top, it almost feels like self-parody. Even much later on in 1984, when Jim Shooter wrote Secret Wars, I like that story, but it too has some pretty problematic elements when it comes to how its female characters were written. On its own, it's fine, although I will point out it's something I noticed and commented on when we originally reviewed that story years ago. But looking over these Avengers books along with Secret Wars, collectively it paints a picture of a man who didn't necessarily hate women, but at best was completely unable to write them. In my opinion, it's far more likely that things are worse than the best case scenario, though. You don't write this way for this many different characters over so many different stories without there being some sort of underlying psychology or pattern to it. There has to be an explanation because the evidence is overwhelming. This all compounds in one final nail in the coffin. After a terrible run of books, late into Jim's run writing Avengers comics, he started to really play around with Hank Pym suffering some sort of mental breakdown. This whole storyline was so dragged out and so confusing and went so far back and forth that on its own, it's a complete disaster. Hank Pym becomes the Yellow Jacket, then gets co-opted by a villain, but then recovers, then he gets a breakdown again and turns onto the team, only for him to outright hit his wife as she tries to stop them in an act of clear-cut domestic abuse. Except, Jim Shooter kind of disputed that assault and claimed that it wasn't supposed to be written that way, and might have been an accident on the part of penciler Bob Hall interpreting a vague script from Jim Shooter. So we had this major cataclysmic change to Hank Pym's character that forever changed what fans thought of him, and apparently it was all done by accident. Regardless of whether or not this was an intentional move on behalf of Shooter, Hall, or Marvel, fans were appalled by Hank's behavior, with many having never forgiven him, not even in the present day, almost 40 years later. The long and bitter feelings were compounded by the fact that Hank Pym, within the context of the story, should never be fully trusted again by the Avengers without them looking like idiots. I don't really defend Marvel through any of this, although I will point out that exploring domestic violence with a character that isn't evil is a very interesting idea that can get into concepts of forgiveness, redemption, complex questions that very much feel relevant to today. Let's not pretend that was the intention of the book or the plan for Hank Pym's character at the time. So the Avengers series at the time in this story is not at all set up to deal with this very serious topic. It was an accident after all. I can't stress that point enough because it goes far in explaining not only the tone and tenor of the story at the time, but also how incompetent this era of Avengers comics truly was. What an insane time for Avengers comics. Two different characters were damaged and in some ways forever stained by two different stories widely considered some of the worst in Marvel's history. Every female member of the team was suddenly turned into a pinup model that had their brains scooped out. And for the big, celebratory 200th issue of the Avengers, we got the worst thing ever made. What other grade could this era of Avengers possibly deserve? Perhaps the saddest part in all of this is that it affected the larger grading scheme of the Avengers and how I view the series as a whole. And the reason for that is very simple. Every time I came across another bad or boring era that would be published later on in this series' history, all I had to do was ask myself, did anyone give birth to a space abomination that tried to breed with their parent? And since the answer was always no, the fact of the matter is nothing may well ever be as bad as the Jim Shooter era of Avengers. And I take some comfort in that to a degree. The Avengers have hit rock bottom a long time ago, over a decade before I was even born. There's something nice in knowing it's almost impossible for the books to ever get as bad as they were at this time. And with that, it's time to move on, kinda, because I want to get into that in-between period I was talking about earlier. After all, while Jim Shooter was ruining the series, maybe some other writers were doing some interesting things. Find out next time on Grading the Avengers here on Comic Island.